All right, good evening, everybody. Hello, hello. It's awesome for me to be here in person with you. I think that we are the first large group evening celebrations that we're having together. We're going to start celebrating by talking about the SAT and ACT.
Yes.
Doesn't that sound like fun? It does. I feel actually will make it fun. And then we're going to roll into the college process, which obviously will also include some info about the SAT and ACT. But we're really excited to have you here. This is our first junior parent meeting. And the first time that I've actually separated, since I've been here at least, the students from the parents. So if I could, I'd have wine and cheese, because it'd be really fun to have all the parents relaxed and talking about this. But instead, we are going to kind of focus on these two issues for tonight. We will be together. This will be our longest meeting of the entire process. If you get through this one, all the other ones will be easy. They're all an hour long. And Phil and I have been working together. We were just trying to figure this out a little while ago, since we think 2017. And actually, I thank the Gallant family for introducing me to Capital Educators with one of their daughters who was taking a class with Phil way back when.
Yep.
And I said, oh, that sounds like a really good fit for the Key School. So Phil runs Capital Educators and has for 20-some
25
years, 25.
Yep.
His philosophy of how he runs the test prep company and the courses that they offer to students is very similar, I feel, to the way that we teach our students. It is a great course that his staff run and offer. He's also been helping us run a 9th grade strategies kind of session, I think is what we'd call it, right?
Yep.
He does our practice ACT for us. He's been a really great partner for Key and a great colleague for me. We often bounce ideas off of each other. As a one-person shop here at Key, it's nice to have colleagues like Phil. So I'm going to turn it over to him. I'm going to go out and make sure that the door is unlocked for our people who can't get in. And then I'll be here to help you if you need it.
Terrific.
Good?
All right. Now I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable, but I'm thinking I'm gonna drop the mask just for articulation, if that's all right, because I'm also being recorded.
Yeah, so we're recording this meeting. There are some families who can't join us. We are not offering Zoom because later on you're going to actually, believe it or not, so don't run out the door. We're going to get up and move around a little bit, stand up, sit down. So it's hard to offer Zoom under that circumstance. So we're both triple vaccinated.
Yep.
If you're not comfortable sitting in the front and you'd rather sit in the back or on the sides, feel free. But we are recording this for families. And our communications department said it'd be a lot easier for his mic to be picked up that way. So. Thanks. Yeah.
People have been moving away from me for years. Now they just have an excuse. It's great to be back. It's great to be in person. I'm Phil Pine. I run Capital Educators. We're not that enormous a group. So while I have a definite plan and some topics I know I want to cover, please ask questions as they pop into your head. You do not need to wait 53 minutes for a very short Q&A. Here's what I want to do. I usually prefer to do this with a mix of students and parents, but I'm going to show you a sample question for a second, just to bring back some unfun memories. I'll tell you this much about the question I've stolen here. I found it on an old SAT, and it was placed near the very end of a math section. Significance being that the questions are ordered by difficulty. So this was one that was designed to be kind of tough. All right. So give it a read if you can make it out here. It says that this person drove 40 kilometers per hour on the way to work, returned along the same route at 60 kilometers per hour. And the question is, what was his average speed for the round trip? All right. So let me ask you this. Where are most 17-year-old eyes going to gravitate really quickly here? What's everyone going to pick? 50, okay? But hopefully I scared you about wanting to select that choice. This kind of answer choice is kind of legendary in testing. It's been around for decades. We in the field call these Joe Bloggs choices because they're the choices that the average Joe tends to pick. And so one habit we try to beat out of students is, okay, that instinct to always do the obvious thing, at least on a late numbered question. See who has a real feel for this guy. What's the next choice this person would pick that's probably also wrong but incredibly tempting? Worse. Think lazy. Yes, okay, it can't be determined. That's basically a dressed up way of saying, you know what, it's kind of hard, I don't really want to do it. And those choices are virtually never going to be right near the end of a test, because if they're going to bother to give you a question, it will have a numerical answer to it. So we're down to 2 options here, but I'd argue we've got better than 50-50 odds, right? Because even if it's been 30 years since you've taken a math class, what makes no sense? Yeah, and I have a very scientific way of eliminating it. I just call it bad, okay? So there you go. We pick choice B, we get our 10 points, and we pick up, more importantly, 10 points we're not supposed to get, because this was a question that was designed to be purposefully tricky. Couple of points here. The good news is there's less of this trickery now than there was decades ago when we all took the test back in high school. The test was littered with these kinds of questions back then. But maybe the more important idea is the placement of this question. I found it on an SAT, but it is equally likely to be on an ACT or a PSAT. Okay? As a matter of fact, these exams have never had more in common than they do right now, okay? Which I think is a tremendous help to our kids. To give you an idea, if I had to throw a number at it, I'd say that the SAT and the ACT are about 80% identical on content. That was not always the case. And if you grew up anywhere near this area, you probably didn't know from the ACT at all. But nowadays, colleges are equally happy, okay, to receive an ACT score or an SAT score. And honestly, even doubly so now in this test optional world, which we'll certainly talk about tonight, okay, colleges are thrilled to get any standardized test score they can from your kids. So you should not worry at the beginning, middle, or end of this process about whether your student submits one of these or one of these. It will make no difference in college admissions. Okay? Backing up just a second. They all took the PSAT in the middle, actually in the end of October, right? On October 26th. Those scores should be back in December. They still take like a ridiculously long amount of time to score PSATs. But as you probably know, well, let me just ask, how important are the PSATs? I got to look like, just get out of here, Phil. It doesn't matter at all, right? Not at all, really, okay? It is a dressed up, okay, official feeling, official looking practice SAT. That's all it is. College admissions offices do not use it for admissions purposes at all. The only times people tend to get excited about the PSAT are if they score at the top, which allows you to be eligible for national merit, right? And I'm sure you've heard of that. But to be perfectly candid, there's much more merit scholarship money out there wrapped up in real SAT and ACT scores. So like if you're practically looking for a discount for college tuition, there's no choice here. You want to do better on the official exam. National merit scholarships affect fewer than 0.5% of testers every year. So I like the PSAT. I think the information you get back in a few weeks will be helpful. I think the scores are really accurate and useful, but no one's going to see it, okay? So I wouldn't get worked up over that. So here we are in November of 11th grade, and we try here to arm the students in a way that they can try to figure out which test might be a better fit. About half the grade took a mock ACT with me about a month ago here on campus. I sent those score reports home. If somehow you didn't get one, just shoot me an email or bug me during our break tonight and I'll make a note to send it over email. Another chunk of students couldn't test that day for various conflicts, and they've grabbed copies of the test and are theoretically going to take them at home, and I will be happy to score them whenever they get them submitted over the next couple of weeks.
No, he said theoretically. We're trying.
Yeah, people have booklets. We'll leave it there. So we're trying to help you navigate this choice, but I want to make maybe a more important point. It's nice to figure out whether you are like temperamentally more of an SAT person or an ACT person. But you don't have to know perfectly for certain, almost at any stage of the game here. circling back to my 80-20 point, okay? Because these tests are so similar, if you start studying for one of them in earnest, I can promise that prep will very quietly and just as equally help you on this test, and vice versa, okay? So what a growing number of students are doing, at least the ones we're able to gently talk into it, is at the end of their prep, many of them are taking both exams, okay? No college is expecting both. No college requires both. But if you take both and do meaningfully better on one test, that might be the score you end up sending. And I mentioned before that I've been doing this for 25 years and I have like no outside hobbies or interests. Actually, I didn't mention that part. I probably didn't need to. But I will still periodically get it wrong. Like I'll think a student is more of an ACT person and they'll surprise me. And so if your student really doesn't mind standardized testing to a great degree, taking both tests at the end of your prep is a great way to hedge your bets. Okay? Now, if they're fighting you on it and if your student is much better at one exam, you can leave it at that. Okay? I want to be clear. I'm not telling you that everyone needs to take both. Yeah, please sit. All right. So now that I've trumpeted the similarities, let me point out a couple of the differences between these exams. This should be one of the few slides I actually included in the one-page handout. The similarities are at the top. The differences, though, tend to be in here. The biggest difference the kids pick up on is that the ACT has a separate, dedicated science part, okay? It's not really hardcore science. It's mostly graphs and tables and charts and reading comp. And it's intimidating because there's a lot of information and it's kind of dense. This is the section most students have the most trouble with at first, before they prep. SAT has never had a science section, okay? But in a not so subtle way, they have just as much science on the SAT. There are 36 scientific reasoning questions scattered throughout the SAT. 2 of the reading passages, always scientific. At least a dozen of the math questions test the same charts and tables and graphs. Point being, you don't want to pick your test based on a love of science or an aversion to it because you're going to be stuck doing about the same amount no matter how you slice it. As a matter of fact, big picture, I wouldn't use a chart like this to definitively figure out which test is better for you as a student. The single best way to determine that is to take these practice tests like we've been recommending. One other difference, ACT, about 1/3 geometry. SAT has almost no geometry now, only 5 to 7 geometry questions on it. Instead, they've doubled down on algebra. There's algebra 1 and algebra 2 to a greater degree on the SAT. The upshot is ACT tends to feel a little easier, but a little broader, testing more stuff more superficially. SAT tends to feel a little harder and a little more narrow and deep in terms of what it tests. But honestly, no student is picking the ACT because they love similar triangles. Like that's not how their thinking goes. For most students, it really comes down to the feel of it and the pacing. And so if they take both practice tests, if they take the PSAT and they take my mock ACT, sure, they'll look at the scores. But some of them will literally just walk out of the testing center and they'll kind of know right away, that was not for me, or that was actually pretty good. The thing they pick up is this. ACT is just many, many more questions per minute. Okay? If you do the math, you'll see it's like 140% versus 100. For some students, this is a non-issue. If you have a kid who doesn't second guess himself, who cruises through tests, okay, doesn't agonize much, the ACT may be a pleasure. But if you have a student who is a little more deliberate, who likes to look over their work, a little more slow, they may find this to be a little disorienting at first. Okay. Small difference worth pointing out. Last June, the SAT eliminated its optional 50-minute essay. You used to have the ability, after sitting for 4 hours, to say, yes, give me more, please. And it's funny, I take the SAT fairly regularly, again, because it's my thing. I never have the patience to stick around for the essay. Like, it's enough, okay? And the good news is SAT dropped it. It literally isn't there. You can't write one even if you want to. ACT hasn't followed suit yet, but it will. And more importantly, your kids are not going to need to write this essay. Unless things reverse in a dramatic way, there is no need for them to sit down and add 40 minutes to their test. So they should just plan to do the multiple choice parts. All right. Any questions so far on these two exams? Please.
What do you mean by tougher curve? I mean, I feel like I know, but.
Yeah. So the ACT has empirically easier questions on it, which is great. But as you might imagine, because they're more easy questions, you have to be more accurate on it, right? So while some students will walk out of the ACT and say, wow, that felt great, it doesn't mean their score will necessarily be any better when you do the equating. About 2/3 of students score basically the same on the two tests. But 30+% of students will do measurably better on one over the other. And that's why I think keeping both tests in mind is not a bad move. All right. So the good news is I'm not just starting. We've already done number one, okay? We've talked a little bit about the PSAT, and I've tried to outline some of the differences between the tests, and I'm happy to answer more questions on that later. But I feel like nowadays it's irresponsible to talk about testing without talking about this, because this has been the central issue circulating in the media from really the beginning of COVID, if not earlier. So hopefully I will clarify and not confuse on this. If you guys talk to the 12th grade class or the parents of the 12th grade class, you probably know that the current seniors who just submitted their first applications, as Laura knows well enough, they've been able to apply almost anywhere they'd like with or without a score, technically, okay? Well over 90% of colleges out there, at least the colleges you know and care about, are currently test optional, all right? If you do look closely, you'll see a couple of exceptions. There's some schools that go even further than being test optional that are test blind, meaning if you did send them an SAT score, they literally would not look at it or use it in admissions at all. Some people call this test free. Of the 500 or so colleges I'm talking about, there were about 36 schools that fell into that category. And that list is gradually growing, okay? Maybe the most notable bullet point that I've listed there, the University of California schools have gone test blind. And that's a big deal and could be its own evening presentation. That I won't go down that rabbit hole. On the other extreme, you'll see that there are really just a handful of places that are requiring testing of all their applicants. Mostly the service academies and some of the larger southern state schools, okay? And this is not perfectly complete, but this does give you a sense. My prediction is that list will continue to grow. I don't think that list is going to change dramatically this summer for your kids. Okay? So while I think your students will see more colleges that require testing, I do think that most of the places they're looking at will technically be optional. Here's why I think that. Going test optional makes admissions more complicated for those officers. It also makes it a little more complicated for you guys as parents. But big picture, it really helps the colleges. The second they go test optional, many, many more people apply, right? And that's because more kids feel more emboldened, right, to apply more places. The other thing that happens, they don't talk about as much, but I'm sure you've been talking about among other counselors, is that these colleges are seeing their incoming freshman scores improve quite a bit in some cases because you've got self-selection, right? The only people submitting their numbers are the ones who are happy with how they did. So if you look at it from a college's vantage point, they get more apps, they get a lower acceptance rate, they have higher test scores, they get rated higher, and they're able to do all this while pursuing something that actually matters, which is providing greater equity and access. While COVID has fueled the test optional movement, okay, the other major stimulus has been the fact that test optional was really meant to help those students who are at lesser schools, who are less affluent, and just have less access. Maybe this stuff doesn't interest you, and you're like, okay, well, how does that affect us? So we'll get more practical. There will probably be a school or two on your students' list next year, okay, that might have been numerically prohibitive a couple years ago. That doesn't mean like everyone's applying to Harvard without scores and getting in, okay? But good chance there'll be one or two places and that the path to admission will widen. But honestly, I don't think it's this point that's the big one. I think it's this point that is. Going test optional puts so much more control in a student's hands and in your hands as a family. Because what they can do now is take these tests, collect their scores, and then in the fall of 12th grade, have some really good conversations with Laura, okay, and figure out what to do with those scores. If your student has scores that are helpful, I don't like to say good or bad, because that's useless, but if they're helpful at the colleges they're targeting, your child may send his scores to literally every school on his list. If you're in the opposite camp, if your student really worked at it but could never get the scores up to the grades and there was this discrepancy, maybe they don't send them anywhere. And what's made things more nuanced and complicated is that last year about 25% of applicants were in the middle, meaning they sent their scores to some places but not to others based on those schools' averages and where they thought the numbers would help. I don't know if 25% really captures what happened here for you last year.
Yeah.
What did you see?
This year, seniors, every single senior, we had a strategy session about what schools am I going to send my scores to and which schools will I not. A few students are fully test optional, but of the students who were sending their scores to schools, if they were applying to 7, 8, or 9 schools, which is kind of our sweet spot number, we were strategizing to say, okay, at your reach schools, you're probably not going to send them, honestly, because you have to be really high,
yeah,
and maybe your score wasn't quite there. At your likely schools, it can actually help you get more merit money, so go ahead and send them. And those target schools in the middle, we kind of like pulled hairs about, right? Like,
yeah.
Okay, should we try it and see? But it is hard too because the scores from last year were inflated, right? Because only the kids that were somehow magically able to find an open testing center and score well. So we went back to data from 2 years ago and looked at those scores, because that was a better barometer for this class, like to look and compare, do I fit in the mid 50% from that class prior?
That's exactly where I'm going. So in order to even be in a place where you can make these decisions, and they're not going to be perfect decisions, there's art and science to it, but they need to take the tests. Okay, if you don't take the test, you're exercising an option, but that's the end of the game, right? That middle 50% is worth talking about. I actually have a little exercise here. This is a very dynamic slide. All right, so College Park. I picked College Park because the greatest number of people I see have it on their list, okay? I took a look, and the average SAT score I could find there for a freshman was about 1380, which is equivalent to 31 out of 36. Now, I'll acknowledge what I just heard. Over here, I just heard Jesus, okay? And a couple of points before we go deeper. Okay. Any school you've all had this experience. If anyone goes to a college reunion, the first conversation you're having with a number of your friends is, we would never get in today, okay? So that's across the board. Our kids are savvier and better prepped, okay, than we certainly were. But there is something else that happens here, okay? SAT scores have been inflated several times over the last several decades. Meaning, a score, I'm just going to make up a score of about 1250 back in the late 80s, okay, not to guess anyone's age here, that's equivalent to about a 1380 today, all right? Yeah, so if you have an unhealthy competitive thing with your kid, I've just armed you with some data. The other thing to keep in mind is with these averages are calculated through a test optional lens, right? With a lot of people not sending scores. And that affects your decision making here. I may surprise you a little bit. Now, here's our first applicant. She earned a 1440 on the official test, okay? For this student, there's not a lot to discuss. This student's going to send her scores to Maryland, almost certainly. They will not only enhance the likelihood she's admitted, they may even be strong enough scores to put her in line for scholars or honors programs, right? Not difficult. Okay, next. Very similar student, at least look-wise, with a 1230. Before you get dismissive, okay, and bubbly in your dismissiveness, that's a very good score, okay? Way, way above the national average. But if you're looking at Maryland and you're a serious candidate for College Park, it's a score you're almost certainly going to decide to shield, as it falls below even the 25th percentile for what they're expecting to see. I think you know what's coming next, okay? Maybe the most interesting case. She looks a little frightened in the middle there, but she's got a 1350. Now, at first blush, you might think shield, this is below the midline. And by the way, particularly if you look at the newest numbers, it'll look even worse, right? With all the score shielding that people have done. But from what we're all hearing and seeing, okay, this is a student who will almost certainly send her scores. Because even if they're not at the exact midline, they are solidly within that middle 50% range that Maryland expects. And you're providing admissions with a data point that tells them very quickly that this kid can do the work there, right? So if you're looking for a starting point with this, you don't need to be at 50. You basically need to be north of 25. Now, if you've listened, I've been saying things like probably and usually because before you make a definitive call, you do need to talk to Laura because she's going to know the much more local element to this, how students at Key have done at these schools over the years, how your students' scores compare with the particular transcript that they have. But if you're just looking to get like a starting point, you can hop online, find the middle 50% at colleges your student is interested in, and you can see pretty quickly to what degree, they may be reachable. And keep in mind, your kids' ultimate SAT and ACT scores will be better than their PSATs coming back. They just will, particularly if they end up prepping the way we'd recommend. Any questions?
Can I just throw in one?
Yeah, please.
So when Phil was saying that there's a lot of pressure, like we have actually a lot of conversations, right? Because it's a strategy with each of your children. And I will just say with Maryland as the example, because we've just had our counselor from Maryland visit us. She gave the example, we were kind of walking through almost these exact same scenarios. And she said also the conversation you want to have with me before a student would submit or not is what program are you applying to within the college, right? So at some universities, you're admitted to the school regardless of your major, and at some you're applying to an engineering program, an architecture program, computer science. I just named 3 that our counselor at Maryland said, you want to be closer to that higher number where she's like all waving at you, or one hand is waving at you, versus that mid-range, right? So that's where when Phil was talking about that, we will just really look very intently and closely at your students' list, and that'll be in the early part of the fall of next year that we would have that discussion. Not after their first SAT, probably when they get that super score, or SAT, ACT. Go ahead.
100% right.
I just have a super quick question.
Please.
It seems like if you decide to shield, just the idea of shielding your score, is that automatically kind of like, the school's like, well, they're shielding it because you have the score. Would that put you at a disadvantage from the start? So, look, your question is based on the question everyone has in their minds, right? If I don't send a score, am I telling them that I did terribly? I think we have to take colleges at their word that test optional means test optional. But I do think a score provides a potential opportunity, right? So if you're able to get a helpful score, all things being equal, you want to share it. I did a quick look at a handful of schools in 2021, and I looked at acceptance rates with and without scores. And in a fairly consistent way, okay, people with scores, okay,
were admitted at a higher rate than people without scores. But this is not a perfect controlled experiment. Odds are these students with scores were very savvy, prepared applicants who knew what they were doing and wrote great essays and had terrific transcripts. But it does make the point that if you can break the tie with an extra piece of information, you should. And you can speak to this even better than I can. If you don't send a score, which is fine, it does put more of a premium on everything else, right? Okay.
Yeah, but and not sending a score, if your student decides not to send their score, the college admissions people, we've had 102 schools through the process this year with the senior class. Every single one of those schools that came, with the exception of 2, were test optional. And every single one said what Phil just said a minute ago. When we say we're test optional, we mean we're test optional. If you don't send the score, we don't ding you for that, we don't hold it against you, we don't put you in the maybe pile or the no pile. We just aren't including that as a data point. We have 26 other things we're looking at, and so now we have 25, right, if you don't send that. It is not weighed as heavily as you think it is in the process, even if you're sending it. Right? Because it's a whole, like, you're going to hear the word holistic from me like 8,000 times. If I had $1 for every time I say it. But that holistic admission process means that your data point is one of many data points as they decide, right? There are so many different factors that go into a decision of yes, that it's not just one number. What we're saying and we're advocating for is you want to have the number, so if you want to play it, you can play it. You don't win if you don't play, right? And then we'll strategize what schools are going to get it and not. But definitely, you know, and actually even all the schools on that list, with the exception of Georgetown, have been here this fall to talk to our students. And every one of them said that, except Georgia Tech requires them. So that optional is optional unless it's not, right? They'd like to be, but they can't.
That's exactly right. Please.
But that's, what I don't understand is that's the year of COVID where, so for example, my son was going through the process, my oldest, and they weren't, nobody was requiring the test because not every kid had the opportunity to take them because of COVID. So it went from being a top criteria to maybe 4th or 3rd. So how could that be accurate if colleges really weren't, if that wasn't a deciding factor? Because if you took it and I couldn't take it,
right,
they wouldn't prefer you.
Right. So, I mean, there's a lot in what you just said, and it's probably hard to unpack all of it. I will say this: test optional as a movement precedes COVID by quite a bit, and COVID just kind of dealt a kind of a death blow. And so your point's a good one. Is it possible that admissions offices will look at things a little differently 2-3 years after COVID, even in a test optional policy? Yeah. But they're under a lot of pressure to stay test optional for the reasons I articulated earlier. Laura mentioned it, you know, it's like you could have you couldn't possibly have 2 equal applicants applying to a college. That's impossible. But imagine you did. And one of them was a world-class figure skater, okay? That extra piece of data might be the thing that breaks the tie. And oftentimes what we're trying to do is have students make themselves stand out in this process and provide that extra bit that can break the tie. To me, I think that the testing is really useful. Not as useful as grades, but useful.
So I guess the question is, if test optional has been, say, many years before COVID, would this graph be the same in, 2017?
Yeah, good question. I don't want to just give you a blanket yes, but I kind of am. Yeah, I think it would have been. And it just would have been a smaller and different group of schools. Many of the smaller elite liberal arts colleges are way ahead of the curve on this and have been test optional for quite some time. Some will have as many as 1/3 to 1/2 of their applicants not send scores. And they have more experience at it too. All right, let me jump ahead for a sec, and then if we do have time for more questions, I'm happy to take them. So we're getting close, unbelievably, to December and the end of the fall semester. Laura and I know that despite our recommendations and advice and guidance, there are always some students who take the official tests on the early side. And you may quietly have done that, and that's fine. hopefully you had a reason, like maybe your student is a strong tester and it wasn't going to hurt them to test early. Or maybe your student is going to be a recruited athlete and you felt like there was some pressure to share a score. Or maybe your summer was just wide open and so the student really did a lot of preparation. But if you haven't touched standardized testing yet, you're in the majority, and that's fine, okay? It's really the next semester when virtually everyone sits for these tests, okay? Sometime between February and June. And one thing we've done here at Key for Access is we've run our course on campus typically in the middle of the spring until the end of the year. So we specifically target the June SAT, and for those kids who will do it, the June ACT. They're offered on back-to-back weekends, and the pink schedule I distributed is timed to meet those test dates. And Laura and I have worked on this. Do you want to maybe speak for a second about the timing of it?
Cute to Phil is like I'm taking my mask off.
Yep,
Something
very subtle.
We are like the dog and pony show. So it's good. Yeah, it's really important, and you're going to hear me say this again, maybe not 8,000 times like holistic admission, but getting through the American Civ program through the majority of the spring, in addition to maybe some test prep that you may choose to do with Phil, or students are studying on their own or using Khan Academy, like Phil's not, I'm not just singing Phil's praises, there are
Right.
lots of options out there. Getting through the Civ program is essential for doing well on those sections of the ACT and the SAT. That is what our curriculum is meant to do, right? We're not teaching to a test, but we are certainly preparing students throughout that curriculum. That vocabulary, that retention, that comprehension, getting through questions, all of that is helpful, right? In addition to what your student may do with Phil or someone else. The other thing is, if you have a student who's in Algebra 2, you don't want to take those tests until they're pretty much done with that, which means if you're prepping in the spring, again with Phil or others, and you take that June ACT, your student, like remember I'm not going to say us, you should throw balls at me when I say we're not doing anything.
Yeah.
The student is going to take that in June because then they're ready, right? They've just finished that amazing course. It's hard for a reason, and then they have all this content in their head. They test in June, and then again, like what we can talk about with at the end of summer for a super score, or right at the beginning of senior year. But for us, we strategically picked that timing with him and with Phil's staff because that's what the prep is at Key, right? That is different in different places. So think about that kind of from the culture of our community.
And this course tends to be pretty much exclusively for Key students. We may get one or two other area students who join, but it's basically for Key students. And we group them into small classes according to their scores and their strengths. And we're careful with the dates. It's conceivable we'll change one or two of them as schedules evolve, but this should give you a good feel for how we do it. Typically, it's twice a week in the early evening right here on campus.
Question, because of timing, what about for kids who are taking multiple APs right around the same time?
Yeah.
So it's almost prohibitive to take this and the study for the AP.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the trade-offs. And so every year I will work with a few Key students earlier in the semester, either ones who are willing to drive up to Baltimore to work with us or who now would work with us virtually. So we have other options. No test date is magically better than any other. It's not like one test is easy and one test is hard. You really have to figure out not only the test date when you're free, but also your willingness to put the time in advance. Any preparation you do, and you can prep on your own, you can prep with a tutor, you could take a class like ours. Any prep you're going to do should do three things. It should help the kids relearn content they probably forgot, okay? Content from 8th and 9th and 10th grades, the foundational material that's on the tests. Good prep will also introduce them to new test-taking techniques and strategies they wouldn't have come up with on their own, particularly for the harder questions. And then the third piece is practice, getting them so familiar and comfortable that they know exactly what to expect on the real day. And so if you look at one of our schedules, we will give as many as 4 tests over a couple of months to just take the surprise element out and also to let us evaluate student progress along the way. I think the goal, no matter how you deal with your prep, I think you want to try to get to the end of junior year with a reasonable score in your pocket. It doesn't have to be your dream score, but I think you want it to be at least representative because at that point in time, you're going to be really looking at colleges pretty intensely, right? And at that point, students are going to want to figure out, are my scores going to actually be helpful to me or not? And if you're in that first category, if you expect to send scores, there's a really good chance that you will test one more time early in the senior year. The most popular combination of dates in today's world is either the August SAT or the September ACT. And that's still early enough in the year to keep all college application options on the table. Early decision, early action, etc. So for the students who end up pursuing testing, they probably sit 2 to 3 total times at most. But everyone's experience is different. And if someone hits it out of the park at the end of junior year, they'll be able to stop. One nice thing about doing good prep, we usually know when a student has sort of maxed out or not because we've got all this practice data on their progress. You don't really want to become a professional tester. This is not the best use of your time for a million reasons. But I do think planning for at least 1 or 2 tests in the spring and maybe 1 more test in the fall is the smartest approach. Any questions on sort of the layout of the timing?
Not the timing, but if you were to average year on year your student scores, what would that be?
Like score improvement, you mean, or just total?
Well, you could do both, score improvement and or the score.
Sure. So I'll give you a couple of data points just to help. I should probably ask you guys, what do you think is the average SAT score nationally for a 12th grader on his way to college? Out of 1,600. I'll play auctioneer. Give me something.
1280.
1280. 1050.
1100.
1100. Do I hear it lower? Okay. I actually think I heard a couple good answers. So 1280 is way higher. Not even close. The 1050 is like right on the money. That's actually the middle 50% for a senior. If you think of it, you're looking at a bell curve, right? So you've got a ton of students whose scores are falling between, 950 and 1150, right? So improving by 100 to 200 points, which is typically pretty reasonable, might make all the difference between having a very average score and being in the top 25%. Or moving from the 75th percentile to the 90th percentile, or the 90th to the 98th. In terms of improvement, what we've seen in our classes, because I've been doing it for forever, we see a median improvement about 160 points. Half our students go up more than 160, half a little bit below. Almost everyone in the 2 months tends to go up between 100 and 250 points.
No matter what the baseline is.
That's the overall number. Now, you're right. Where you start and how earnestly you work at it, obviously there are a million factors at play. But what's really amazing is that the SAT has changed like 4 times over since I started doing this, and our improvements have been exactly the same across all 4 different iterations, which kind of makes me wonder what they're doing when they invest all this time in changing these tests. I just want to make one point about the scores, and then I'm gonna roll it over to you. I think I'm doing pretty well here, Laura. All right. So, how many of you have heard of this expression, super scoring? Okay. So, I mentioned before that most people will test 2 to 3 times. The main reason for it is how colleges use the scores. Nowadays, about 90% of American schools you care about will super score the SAT, which just means if you take it a couple times, they will use the highest pieces they can extract. So here's a student with a 1240, okay, her first time around. Happy with how she did in the math, but wanted to go up in verbal, so she prepared again. Her total score dropped, so it looks like that was a wasted effort, but you know where I'm going with this. What virtually every college in the country will do is use the highest combination of numbers it can find, and that's super scoring, okay? Just to complicate things, the ACT is super scored also, just not quite as much. SAT is about 90%, ACT is more like 70%, And you can look college by college at score policies. And the reason that matters is that might prompt a student to test an extra time or not. ACT is scored out of 36. One reason it's not super scored quite as much is there are 4 scores, right? So you have 4 opportunities for something to improve. Something almost always does, even if it's not the subject you were working at oftentimes. So even if just one number improves, in this case it was the science, it'll generate a higher average score. When you guys are comparing scores, you can look online for concordance tables. Those will help you very quickly compare what does a 26 mean versus an SAT score, 1220. Okay, but you'll be able to find that, and that'll help you determine whether your student is naturally better suited to one test. Please. Great. So, wow, it's interesting. It's good timing though. Typically, to be super scored, different colleges have different policies, but typically you send them both days and they will do it in an automated fashion. There's some colleges that will allow you to self-report the scores, where you don't send a transcript. You tell them what you got as a super score. They accept you, and then before you set foot on the campus, you send the official transcript to validate, to make sure people are honest about it. Yeah, so if you're happy with how you did on both tests, you can very happily and very nerdily send both. But nobody's expecting that. And I'd say, the overwhelming majority will end up sending just one. Let me see if there are any other last questions. I should have included my email in the stuff here. Obviously, I'd be happy to work with some of your kids this spring in the course in one way or another. But don't hesitate to use me just as a support. I will get back to you right away over email. I'm really quick.
So every school takes either the SAT or none of them just take one or the other. Sorry, none of them take one or the other.
No,
Okay.
they are equally happy with either. There's no preference anymore.
So what you're saying is if somebody got a 1220 and a 26, so both, which one would you say to them?
Okay, if you had a 26 and a 1220, if you had perfectly even scores, and those scores were solid for the particular college, and those scores meshed with your B+ average, you might send them both, just to show the school some initiative. But I don't think sending the second score is going to make any kind of difference, really.
They send the SAT or something.
In that case, no. But if there was a little bit of a discrepancy, we would just send the one. Yeah.
So when do you sign up for the course at Key if you decide to take that course?
I'm sorry,
When do you sign up for the course at Key?
At Key?
If you decide to take that?
yeah, I feel like we usually get that information out when? In December, January for the spring class?
Yes, you have this sheet. If they called right now, they could still
Yeah.
register for it, but you'll also get a copy of it from me tonight. So yeah, usually December, but we can do that one.
And just email me. I have on my website a way you can sign up in 2 minutes, no problem. But we don't take your payment. That we make sure to talk to everybody in advance because we want to make sure it makes sense before you commit the time.
Does each session cover both read, math, and English?
Yeah. So
From other son, so contention, but in the small groups, and then it was mostly remote. So there was mix and matching, but that would be harder to do in person, I'm guessing. So how do you handle that?
yeah. So most nights I think we meet from 6 to 9 p.m. And so we literally split it in half with a 90-minute math class, a 90-minute verbal class. And we do group by score. We group a little more carefully on the math side because we find that homogeneity is more important given just the wide span of math backgrounds. And then we break them out.
How do you deal with missed classes? Because let's say sports. Sport games go up and interfere with 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening.
How do we deal with this with the conflict? So we've been doing it in 2 ways. We've been meeting some students before class on other days, like when they've missed something. The teachers have come early and we've met for an hour or 2 before the classes start. But we've also been using Zoom quite a bit. As a matter of fact, if you look closely, you'll see we also are going to have online extra help hours every week for students to work remotely. So we can usually do just fine. I mean, if someone's going to miss 5 or 6 days, it's a problem. But if they're going to miss 1 or 2, our guys will catch them up. All right. Okay. I was trying to make you feel better about this. I don't know if I've succeeded. But thank you so much for hosting me. Oh, yeah, please.
You're going to do all these sessions? Or,
Yes, it's all the sessions.
I mean, the student has to attend all these sessions?
Typically, yeah. Yeah. This is bad. Usually the students are the ones
I
pointing
know.
that out.
Exactly. Just be glad you're not taking it.
Yeah.
That's funny.
The one thing I will say too is, and this helps me sleep at night, obviously the first goal of the course is to get scores up. And that's obviously everyone's first and primary objective. But what we're working on really does have educational legs. I mean, it's going to make them stronger testers in other environments, and it's going to strengthen their foundational high school knowledge. So even if someone goes through the course and doesn't end up sending their scores everywhere, I still think the course really does serve a good value. But all right, I'll stop. Thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Phil.